U.S. beef in Australia. What's behind the lifted ban and Trump's celebration? Australia is about to open its doors to U.S. beef, but don't expect to see it on your local supermarket shelves anytime soon. This decision, hailed by Donald Trump as a major victory, has sparked a heated debate about trade, biosecurity, and whether this move is a win for consumers or a concession to political pressure. Let's break down what's really at stake. Will American beef actually make it to Aussie shelves? Australia's beef market is dominated by domestic producers, with over 99% of the meat sold in restaurants, pubs, and supermarkets coming from local cattle. Industry experts, including Dr. Kate Sievert from Deakin University, argue that U.S. beef won't disrupt this dominance. Why? For starters, the U.S. relies heavily on feedlots, where animals are raised in more controlled environments, which might lower production costs, but doesn't necessarily make their beef cheaper for consumers. Plus, the U.S. already exports niche cuts, like premium steaks and specialty cuts, that are widely available in Australia through existing channels. What might change? U.S. beef could start appearing in processed foods, fast food chains, or frozen ready meals, where price sensitivity is higher. But even then, the volume is unlikely to be significant. As Sievert explains, it's not about replacing Australian beef. It's about filling gaps in specific segments of the food system. But here's where it gets controversial. President Trump has taken full credit for the decision, claiming it's a triumph for U.S. agriculture. Yet Australia's government insists this move is purely about biosecurity, not trade negotiations. Trade Minister Don Farrell even went as far as saying, "We're not doing this to entice the Americans into a trade agreement." But is that really the case? Critics, including the Nationals' debut leader Kevin Hogan, argue that linking the decision to Trump's demands for tariff reductions is disingenuous. The U.S. has been pushing Australia to lift the ban for years, and this timing, amid Trump's aggressive trade rhetoric, raises eyebrows. If Australia's goal is to eliminate U.S. tariffs on its own exports, is this decision a strategic move or a slippery slope? The BSE ban, a decade-long saga. This isn't a sudden policy flip. Australia banned U.S. beef in 2003 after an outbreak of mad cow disease, BSE. The rules only began to shift in 2015, when the U.S. was upgraded to Category 1 status, meaning its BSE controls were deemed sufficient. But even then, a key hurdle remained. Beef had to come from cattle born and raised in the U.S. That restriction was finally lifted in 2024, allowing imports from cattle born in Canada or Mexico, provided they're traceable and legally slaughtered in the U.S. Yet the U.S. itself is struggling. Cattle herds have shrunk by 1% in 2024, with imports from Canada and Mexico playing a critical role in bolstering their numbers. Now, with Mexico's live cattle imports suspended due to a flesh-eating pest, the U.S.'s reliance on Australian access becomes even more complicated. What's next for Australian farmers? While the government claims biosecurity standards are non-negotiable, farmers worry about long-term implications. Could this set a precedent for relaxing rules on other imports? And with the U.S. facing its own agricultural challenges, is this a one-way street for Australia? The bottom line? This decision is a mix of science, politics, and economics. As Farrell puts it, our national interest is the removal of all those tariffs. But if Australia's farmers and consumers are to be believed, the real battle is just beginning. So, is this a win for free trade or a compromise on food safety? Share your thoughts below. Trump's beef deal. Why Australia won't buy American beef. Here's a bold claim that's shaking the economic world. President Donald Trump recently declared the U.S. will flood Australia with so much beef that it'll be impossible to ignore. But hold on. Economists and industry insiders are raising red flags. Let's unpack why this promise might be more political theater than market reality. And here's where it gets controversial. Trump's optimism clashes head-on with the cold, hard facts of supply, demand, and global trade dynamics. Could this be a case of presidential overconfidence, or is there a hidden angle no one's talking about? Let's dive in. Australia recently announced it would ease biosecurity rules for U.S. beef, a move hailed as a breakthrough by U.S. trade officials. But analysts argue this won't trigger a beef boom. Why? Australia is already a powerhouse in beef production, with prices far lower than what U.S. ranchers can offer, The U.S. currently exports only small amounts of beef to Australia, while importing far more lean cuts for hamburgers. This imbalance is no accident. U.S. cattle herds have shrunk to a record low of 94.2 million head due to droughts that ravaged grazing lands. Ranchers have been forced to cull herds, driving up domestic prices. Compounding the problem, a ban on Mexican cattle imports due to a deadly pest, and looming tariffs on Brazilian beef could tighten U.S. beef export supplies even further. Dan Norsini, a U.S. livestock trader, bluntly put it, "We're struggling to meet our own demand. Selling beef to Australia? That's not happening." The numbers back him up. Last year, Australia shipped $2.9 billion worth of beef to the U.S., while U.S. exports to Australia totaled just 269 tons. David Anderson, an agricultural economist, explains the gap. Australia has more cattle than people. That's their export edge. But it's not just about quantity, it's about taste. Australian consumers prefer grass-fed beef, while U.S. cattle are often grain-finished, creating a flavor divide. Jerry Klassen, a market analyst, predicts this cultural preference will keep U.S. exports to Australia minimal for years. Carl Setzer of Kansas Ag adds, "We're not in a position to export much, and Australia doesn't really need our beef." Trump, however, seems blind to these realities. His social media post crowing about irrefutable proof that U.S. beef is the safest and best has sparked backlash. Critics argue his trade rhetoric ignores decades of Australian barriers to U.S. beef, which were finally lifted after years of biosecurity reviews, not political favors. Australian officials stressed the decision was based on improved U.S. traceability systems, not a quid pro quo for a Trump-Albanese meeting. Yet some Australian politicians are skeptical. Shadow Agriculture Minister David Littleproud warned the move might compromise biosecurity standards for political gain. Meanwhile, Trump's trade threats, like 200% tariffs on pharmaceuticals, add another layer of tension. When asked if the beef deal would lead to a broader trade agreement, Australian Trade Minister Don Farrell shrugged. "We did this for our farmers, not to sweeten a deal with the U.S." So where does this leave us? Trump's vision of a beef-filled U.S.-Australia trade bonanza faces an uphill battle against economics, consumer preferences, and political pragmatism. But here's the twist. What if this is less about beef and more about a symbolic win in Trump's broader trade war narrative? Do you think his optimism is justified, or is this another example of political overreach? Share your thoughts in the comments. Let's debate it out. Economists challenge Trump's U.S. beef export claims to Australia. Trade Analysis 2024. U.S. President Trump's recent claim that America is poised to flood Australia with beef exports has sparked heated debate across agricultural circles. While Trump confidently declared, "We will sell so much beef to Australia," economists, traders, and industry analysts counter with a blunt reality. The U.S. isn't even meeting its own beef demands right now. Let's unpack why this bold projection faces major roadblocks. First, the numbers don't lie and they reveal a stark supply reality. The U.S. cattle herd has plunged to a record low of 94.2 million head, driven by years of drought that scorched grazing pastures and forced ranchers to scale back operations. This scarcity has pushed U.S. beef prices to historic highs. Meanwhile, Australia, a global beef powerhouse, exported nearly 400,000 metric tons of beef to the U.S. last year, dwarfing the mere 269 tons sent the other way. Here's where the controversy truly ignites. Trump's assertion disregards Australia's status as a net beef exporter. The country boasts lower production costs and a strong preference for grass-fed beef, which contrasts sharply with the grain-fed marbled cuts favored in American ranching. Australians prefer their own tastes, explains Jerry Klassen, a leading ag analyst. We're not in a position to export much, and they don't need our beef. But wait, Canberra just relaxed import rules. Doesn't that change everything? Not quite. While Australia lifted some biosecurity restrictions after improving U.S. traceability systems, key barriers remain. The decision wasn't part of trade negotiations, Australian officials emphasize, but a result of years-long safety assessments. Yet political opponents like David Littleproud warn, is Canberra compromising biosecurity standards merely to score a meeting with Trump? Three major hurdles block a U.S. beef bonanza. 1. Supply constraints. The U.S. faces dual pressures, a ban on Mexican cattle imports due to New World screwworm, and looming 50% tariffs on Brazilian beef starting August 1st. These policies could tighten domestic supplies further, forcing the U.S. to import more Australian beef rather than export its own. 2. Pricing realities. U.S. beef prices hit record levels this year, making competing with Australia's lower-cost exports nearly impossible. "We're not going to sell anything significant," admits independent trader Dan Norsini. "We can't even meet our own needs." 3. Cultural preferences. Australians disproportionately favor grass-fed beef, which aligns with their production methods. The marbled, grain-fed cuts common in U.S. production often don't match local taste profiles. The political wildcard. Trump and U.S. Trade Representative Jamieson Greer framed Canada's decision as a bilateral victory, calling it a major milestone for U.S. farmers. Yet Australian Trade Minister Don Farrell rejects the notion, stating bluntly, "We didn't do this for a trade deal." The tension underscores a deeper divide. Should nations prioritize hard-fought biosecurity standards or volatile trade relationships? So, will Trump's prediction hold up? Experts like David Anderson of Texas A&M maintain Australia's enormous cattle-to-population ratio makes it a natural exporter. They have more cattle than people, he notes. This gap won't close anytime soon. Add in the logistical challenges of U.S. cattle potentially originating from Canada and Mexico, which complicates beef production tracing, and the likelihood of meaningful exports seems remote. The vital question for readers: should governments prioritize trade deals over strict biosecurity protocols? Do you agree with Trump's optimistic outlook? Or do supply-demand dynamics render it unrealistic? Share your thoughts below.